When Carrie Ann and I learned that we were pregnant for the first time, we immediately started thinking of possible names. Because we both have names that connect us to our families, gifting our son with a name that ties him to his larger family story felt important. We also want our children to feel deeply a part of the larger faith story, so finding a way to connect his name in that way was a priority too. It took time, but we eventually settled on the name Lucas Campbell. The name Lucas is often given as a way of honoring Luke, the evangelist and gospel writer. The Gospel of Luke is our favorite of the four Gospels. It reflects for both of us what we find so significant about the Christian faith: Christ's attention and concern for the poor and the oppressed. The Gospel of Luke is the only Gospel that includes the parable of the Good Samaritan, Mary's Magnificat, and the reading of Isaiah to proclaim God's good news to the poor as quoted in Luke 4. Spelling Lucas in this way, Loukas, also connects to my grandmother, Betty Lou, the only of my grandparents that he will never meet. Campbell is rich with my family history. Campbell University is the place where my parents, his Grandma Neat and G-Daddy, first met. Campbell Law School is where my dad began his journey as an attorney. On Campbell's campus is where my mom spent her childhood. In Campbell's Science Building is where my grandfather taught chemistry for 45 years. In Campbell classrooms, my Grandma Jung instructed students in the School of Education through art and song. And for 4 years, I represented the Fighting Camels on the Campbell University soccer field. Though a small school, Campbell University has had a significant influence on our family, and for that reason, Campbell, as name and school, holds a very special meaning in our hearts. The act of naming a child is different, family to family. There are so many naming traditions from cultures and communities around the world. Children are named for relatives who are deceased as a way of carrying on a legacy. Children are gifted names that are intended to guide the development, path, and personality of that life. Children are blessed with names that reflect how or when a child was born into the world. In one Australian tribe, the midwife calls out names of the baby's living relatives, and the name that is called when the placenta is delivered is the name that the child will receive. In some Hindu traditions, families hold a naming ceremony during which a priest or astronomer chooses the first letter of a child's name based on the date and time of their birth, as well as the alignment of the stars and the planets. In some communities, the naming ceremony is performed by the paternal aunt, who chooses a name for the child and whispers it into his or her ears before announcing it to the family. In some Native American traditions, the parents choose the name of a deceased loved one, called an atik, or a soul name, a few days after the baby is born. Only then is the child considered a complete person. Some also believe a newborn will stop crying once the correct name has been chosen. In the Greek tradition, a son takes his first name from the first name of his paternal grandfather and takes his middle name from the first name of his father. The idea being that when he introduces himself, one would immediately know what family this child belongs. James shared with me a few rituals still practiced in Liberia. The Kru tribe does not name a baby until 7 days after birth, making sure the baby will live before giving a name. Other tribal groups allow naming to be done only by grandparents. In some traditions, choose names for the meaning. For example, James's middle name is Hemi, which means everyone's child. When Isaac and Rebekah name Esau and Jacob, it is just after the twins are born. They name Esau first, since he is oldest. Because he was covered with red hair, his name means hairy or rough. Jacob is right on Esau's heels, literally, hanging on to Esau's foot with his hand. So his name, Jacob, could mean follow behind or heel, but could also mean cunning or trickster. Often in stories, names are intended to disclose something about one's character, and Jacob spends all of his childhood and most of his young adulthood living fully into his name. By the time that we get to the part of Jacob's story that we're reading today, we have seen Jacob con, cheat, deceive, and manipulate almost every member of his family, and then run off when the tension is about to explode in full conflict. He tricks his own brother out of his birthright, and then cheats him out of his father's blessing. He steals away his father-in-law's flock and manipulates his family into leaving with him in the secret of night. Even here, as he fears his tricks have caught up with him, and he is sure to face the wrath of his brother's vengeance, he is sending ahead gifts of appeasement and hiding away his family and his wealth. This is where our text picks up. Jacob is traveling home for the first time since he stole his brother's blessing. Esau has received word that Jacob is coming and has made arrangements to meet him before he gets into Canaan. Jacob divides up his wealth, sends his family and flock across the river ahead of him, and makes camp alone to keep watch for Esau. That night, Jacob finds himself in a full-on wrestling match with a mysterious figure of a person. The story literally says a man wrestled with him until daybreak. It is hard at first to know who or what this figure might be. Has Esau attacked Jacob in the dark of night? Is this a figurative story in which Jacob wrestles with himself, with his conscience, with his fear of Esau? Is this an angel, a divine presence, or God's very self? Whoever or whatever this presence is, Jacob is determined, strong, and unrelenting in his fight, and in a surprising turn, the figure asks Jacob for his name. In this moment, we hear echoes of Jacob's past. On the day that Jacob steals his brother's blessing, he disguises himself as Esau. His father, dying, blind, and feeble, wants to be sure that he is talking to the right son. So 3 times Isaac asks Jacob, "Which son are you?" And all 3 times, with everything to gain and his soul to lose, Jacob answers him with a name that is not his own. "I am your son Esau." But here, Jacob is on the run. He fears his trickster plans and the vengeance of his brother are closing on him quickly. He is fully involved in what feels like a fight for his very life, and he is holding on tight with all that he has to save himself, and in doing so, hopefully to save those that he loves. He is refusing to let go when the stranger asks his name. In a last-ditch effort to save himself and his soul at the expense of possibly losing everything, Jacob gives his name. "My name is Jacob," and the figure is revealed as God. This is a strange exchange. There are a couple places in the Bible where God engages in dialogue around God's name. Moses asks God, "When the people ask who sent me, what will I tell them?" And just after this scene, Jacob in return asks God for God's name, but God never answers directly. Jewish tradition holds that God's name is too sacred and too intimate to be fully known or spoken by people. To ask God's name is an extension of intimacy that is believed to be too much. And yet here, God extends intimately toward Jacob, making the most vulnerable moment of Jacob's encounter with the divine not the all-night, blood-drawing, hip-breaking fight to death, but what was even more vulnerable than staring into his own mortality was looking God in the face and exposing himself fully and completely. "My name is Jacob." It is not simply an admission. That one sentence is an open confession of all that Jacob has done to this point. "I am Jacob, the one who stole from and cheated my brother. I am the Jacob who deceived my father from inheritance. I am the Jacob who hustled my father-in-law out of wealth. I am the Jacob who even to this night has been looking for the easy way out. I am Jacob the con, the trickster, the hustler. To allow oneself to be known so completely is absolutely terrifying. Brené Brown is a research professor at the University of Houston's Graduate School of Social Work. She has dedicated the last 20 years of research to work around shame and vulnerability. As a society, we protect ourselves from perfectionism, judgment, exhaustion as a status symbol, productivity as self-worth, needing to look or to be cool, shaping ourselves by what other people think, our obsessive need to outperform, proving our self-worth, searching for certainty. And all of this we do in an effort to keep everyone else from seeing our screw-ups, our imperfections, our fear. In many ways, vulnerability is seen as weak. But Brown argues that vulnerability is rooted in courage. Vulnerability is about the willingness to see our lives and to be seen in our lives. It is the means through which we are able to receive and experience redemption. Giving voice to who we are, all of who we are, creates possibility to learn and to grow. It opens our souls to grace and renewal. This kind of vulnerability is what makes it possible for people with addiction to move into and through the steps of recovery. This kind of vulnerability allows those who have lived through unspeakable trauma to move toward healing without carrying the burden of shame. This kind of vulnerability lays a foundation for the deep level of personal and communal accountability that it is going to take for us to begin dismantling the racist systems of our society and our own racist bias, so that we can better understand what it means to create anti-racist systems that serve all people fully and fairly. This kind of vulnerability creates space for repentance, forgiveness, and transformation. It is this kind of vulnerability, Brené Brown says, that is the core, the heart, the center of meaningful human experience. My friend Mary shared this story on Facebook this week. She says, "Around noon, there was a series of super loud knocks at my front door. I opened the door to a masked man who I didn't recognize immediately. And then I saw his eyes, and I realized that it was our friend T, who I hadn't seen for more than a year. The girls and I had been missing him and more recently had been worried about his health. T's life hasn't been easy. He has a record and had been without steady employment and housing for periods of time. 7 years ago, he knocked on our door to see if he could mow our lawn for some food or cash. If I'm honest, he did a truly lousy job, but he kept coming back and he kept getting better at it. The girls and I saw him weekly or monthly or every few months, depending on the season and whether he was working. Over time, we became friends and would swap stories and share a meal or lemonade. We'd sit and talk about life, the joys and the challenges. When my marriage collapsed, T offered kindness and also challenged me to pull it together. When his life would go off track, I did the same. When he had a job, he would check in every once in a while to let me know that he was okay. And then he'd disappear for a long time, and I was afraid that we had lost him for good. So back to this morning. T was brimming with excitement as he handed me an envelope. His voice kind of quivered, and he said, "It's an invitation to my wedding. I'm getting married, and I have a steady job, and my life is so good." His lovely fiancée joined us on the porch, and the girls came out to see both of them and to celebrate. Then I cried. T has come so far with so much stacked against him, and now he's moving to a new, brighter chapter. He looked so alive and so happy and peaceful, unlike any other time that I've seen him. It is all good. Our friendship is one that has endured over 7 years of ups and downs, death and resurrection. What started with a stranger knocking at the door evolved into trust and care and mutual respect. Vulnerability is the only way that we truly engage in meaningful relationships with one another, and it changes us fundamentally, right down to our names. These two went from being Mary and T to friend, brother, sister, family. When Jacob confessed his name to God, he did not receive the judgment or the punishment that he feared or perhaps even deserved. Instead, he was met with divine grace. He received a new name, Israel, a name that connected him to the fuller God story happening around and even through him, a name through which he could see himself more fully and graciously, a name gifted to him by God. Jacob's story is our story too. This story is an invitation for each one of us to stand humbly and vulnerably in the presence of God and to know the grace that meets us there. It is not an escape from our consequences. Jacob's injured hip and limp served to remind him of this encounter with God and his life before. As my friend Rydell once reminded me, we don't get to live life with a pencil and eraser. We can't just erase the things we wish weren't there. Instead, we live with Sharpies in hand so we can see the places we've had to mark through, adjust, edit, start over. It makes us more honest, more humble, and it reminds us that we are human. The story of Jacob does not let us forget that we are never outside the reach of God's extravagant love. It calls us to see ourselves honestly in a way that we might be changed, redeemed, and renewed by God's grace. And it begs us to know more fully our connection to the God story happening around us and even through us, in soul and body and name. If you ask my oldest his name, he will tell you without hesitation, Lucas Campbell Story-Bunce. That is the name that we chose for him. That is the name that he shares with his great-grandmother, whom he will only know through family stories. That is the name that ties him to my favorite writer of the Jesus story. That is the name rooted in a long family history in the small town of Bowie's Creek, North Carolina. That is the name that we wrote on his kindergarten registration. That is the name that his kids call him on the playground. And that is the name that I say in full when I'm at my wit's end. But when we tuck him in at night, though he is our Lucas, the name that we repeat to him with his prayers is Beloved. Beloved was gifted to him long before we knew we had a little one to name. Beloved is the blessing that I hope he clings to when he is at his worst and when he is at his best. Beloved reminds him that he is never outside the reach of God's extravagant love. Beloved calls him to see honestly the ways that he is still being shaped by and formed by God's ever-present grace. Beloved connects him undeniably to the fuller God story happening around and through him, as it does for all of us. Beloved is his name, and beloved is your name too.